X is down again. Elon Musk claims it's a cyber attack, but is that really the case? Let's break down what happened and what it means for the platform. So if you tried to hop on X earlier today, you might have noticed things weren't exactly running smoothly.
Yeah, I kind of felt like the whole thing was having a bit of a digital meltdown, right?
Exactly. And Down Detector, that site everyone checks when they think their internet is acting up, yeah, well, it was lighting up like a Christmas tree. I mean, around 40,000 reports popping up right around 10 in the Eastern time. That's a lot of people suddenly finding themselves cut off from the digital town square.
It's a pretty good sign that something was definitely off.
Yeah, for sure. So we're going to try to figure out exactly what went down today on X. We've got the CNN report that sort of pieces together the timeline, brings in some different perspectives.
Yeah, including Elon Musk himself weighing in.
Yeah, he definitely had some thoughts. Plus, we've got some insights from a cybersecurity expert who, shall we say, has a slightly more cautious take on the whole thing.
Always good to have ballast via, Ray.
Totally. So what we really want to do today is we'll really get to the bottom of this whole X outage, like what actually happened, who's saying what, and what's still totally up in the air.
Yeah, love a good mystery.
Well, let's jump right in. This CNN report makes it clear that almost as soon as the issues on X started cropping up, there was already a narrative starting to form.
Right, and that narrative, well, it came straight from the top.
Exactly. I mean, Elon Musk didn't waste any time. He came out and very clearly stated that he believed this whole mess was a massive cyber attack. And he didn't stop there.
Oh, no, he definitely gives some specifics. In an interview with Fox Business, he went on to say that it seemed like the IP addresses linked to this attack, well, they appeared to be coming from the Ukraine area.
Yeah, that's a pretty bold statement. And then he kind of doubled down on that whole thing on X itself. He started talking about how this wasn't just some random isolated incident, you know. He seemed to be suggesting that there was a chance this was orchestrated by a large coordinated group in Andorra, a country. I mean, those are some serious accusations to throw around.
Definitely not mincing words there. He also replied, yes, to a user who suggested that this whole thing might have been a deliberate attempt to silence both him and the entire platform. So, yeah, he's really painting a picture here.
Totally. But, you know, it's really important to remember that while Elon is jumping in with both feet, we got to balance his claims against the data we actually have, right? And this is where Down Detector comes in. That spike in reports we talked about earlier, well, that gives us a pretty good indication of what users were experiencing on the ground.
Wait, and the timeline kind of matches up with what you were saying. Starting around 6 a.m. Eastern time, you got these reports trickling in, then boom, by 10 and it hits that massive peak of 40,000 reports. And then, thankfully, things start to calm down a bit. By 2 p.m., things seem to be mostly back to normal. But the report also highlights that this wasn't just some isolated pocket of users. We're talking about reports coming in from all over the globe.
But it's also super important to remember that the whole Down Detector thing, it's all based on people actually taking the time to report a problem.
Amber, yeah, it's self-reported data. So that 40,000, it might just be the tip of the iceberg. I mean, there could be a whole bunch of people out there who are having problems, but just didn't bother reporting it.
Totally makes sense. Okay, so we've got Elon's take, we've got the Down Detector numbers, and now this is where it gets interesting. We've got the cybersecurity expert, Eric Noonan, who, well, he's urging everyone to just take a breath and maybe not jump to any conclusions.
Yeah, he's the CEO of Cybersheath, and he's basically saying, hold your horses, folks. It's way too early to say for sure if this whole thing was actually a cyber attack or not.
Which is, you know, a pretty fair point. You got to investigate, look at the evidence, all that. He also makes this great point about, you know, taking those initial statements, especially when they come out right after something like this happens, with a big grain of salt.
Right, because in the heat of the moment, people don't always have all the facts. Emotions run high.
Totally. So you need time to actually look into things before you start pointing fingers. Okay, so the CNN report also gets into this whole thing about IP address masking or spoofing. This seems like a super important piece of the puzzle, especially when we're trying to figure out who might be behind a cyber attack, right? Can you break that down for us a little?
Absolutely. So think about it like this. When you send something over the internet, it's kind of like sending a wire, right? It's got your return address on it, but your IP address.
Gotcha.
But with some technical know-how, you can basically fake that return address. That's what IP masking or spoofing is all about. So someone could make it look like an attack is coming from Ukraine, like Elon said, but the real source could be, well, pretty much anywhere.
Just like sending a postcard from Paris when you're actually sitting on your couch in, I don't know, Omaha.
Exactly. It makes it really tricky to definitively say, yep, this attack came from this place because the digital trail can be intentionally misleading. And that's why, those cybersecurity folks, they always stress the need for thorough analysis. You can't just jump to conclusions based on what appears on the surface.
Makes sense. So the report also does a good job of explaining the difference between DDoS attacks and ransomware attacks. Could you give us a quick rundown of what those are and why it matters in this whole X situation?
Sure thing. So a DDoS attack, it stands for distributed denial of service. Basically, imagine you've got a website, right? It's like a shop, and it can only handle so many customers at once. Now, imagine someone sends a huge mob of people to your shop, way more than you can handle. Everyone's crowding in, trying to get in, but nobody can actually buy anything because it's just too chaotic.
So it's like creating a massive digital traffic jam, basically.
You got it. A DDoS attack aims to overload a website or a service with so much bogus traffic that it just collapses under the pressure. Real users can't get through because the system is totally overwhelmed. Now, ransomware, that's a whole different beast.
Right, that one sounds a bit more sinister.
It can be. Think of it like this. Someone breaks into your house, changes all the locks, and then says, hey, if you want your keys back, you got to pay up. Ransomware attacks, they basically lock down your data. They encrypt it, and the only way to get it back is to pay the attackers a ransom. The CNN report notes that while ransomware attacks are becoming more common because, well, there's a lot of money to be made that way, a DDoS attack really seems more aligned with just causing chaos and disruption. And the thing is, with the DDoS attack, there's usually so much traffic, and a lot of it is deliberately disguised through spoofing, that it makes tracing it back to the actual source even harder.
So we can't rule out either possibility at this point. Now, this isn't the first time Elon has brought up the idea of cyber attacks when X or other companies he's involved with have hit some technical snags, right?
Yeah.
And the report actually mentions a few past instances.
Yeah, it seems like a bit of a pattern. They highlight a few examples. Back in August 2024, when Elon was having that conversation with Donald Trump on X, and there were all those delays, well, Elon actually suggested that a cyber attack might be the culprit. He even said there was a 100% probability of DDoS attacks because the event was such a big deal.
It's like he's always prepared for that to be the explanation.
Yeah.
And then there were those technical issues that happened during Ron DeSantis' presidential campaign announcement on X back in 2023. Although, in that case, they didn't explicitly pin it on a cyber attack. But it does make you wonder.
It does, and it's important to remember that X has gone through some massive changes since Elon took over back in 2022.
Right, like cutting a ton of staff, changing how things work. I mean, the CNN report gets into how he laid off something like 80% of the workforce. We're talking about engineers, people who keep the whole system running.
Yeah, those are pretty massive changes. So, it's not crazy to think that maybe, just maybe, all those changes could have something to do with the platform's overall stability or lack thereof. Like maybe it's more vulnerable to technical issues, whether those issues are caused by external attacks or just internal hiccups. It's definitely a factor to consider.
Yeah, X has been in a constant state of flux since Elon took over. Speaking of Elon and things he's involved in, the CNN report also mentions how Tesla stock took a pretty big hit today. Dropped by 15%, wiped out all the gains they made since Trump's election.
Oh, wow, that's a big drop.
And the report also reminds us about his role heading up Trump's Department of Government Efficiency, or, DOGE as they call it. Kind of makes you realize just how many different things Elon has his hands in these days.
Right. Like on top of everything else, he's also dealing with a massive stock drop in one of his other companies. It was a busy day for him.
No kidding. Well, okay, so let's try to wrap this up. Where do we stand? What's the big takeaway? Because at the end of the day, the CNN report makes it clear that we still don't have any official explanation for what caused this big disruption on X. They reached out for comment, but, well, X didn't get back to them, which, let's be honest, has kind of become their MO when it comes to the press these days.
Yeah, radio silence seems to be the preferred method of communication. So here's what we know. We had this huge service disruption that impacted people all over the world. We had Elon Musk saying it was a cyber attack that came from somewhere in Ukraine. We don't have any independent confirmation of that. And we have this cybersecurity expert saying, hey, let's not get ahead of ourselves, especially since figuring out who's behind the cyber attack is really, really hard. Plus, we have to factor in all those big changes X has gone through, which might be playing a role in all this. So, yeah, lots of moving pieces here.
It's like a giant jigsaw puzzle where we only have a few of the pieces. So let's try to connect the dots for our listeners. If you've tried to use X today, you probably got pretty frustrated, right? Now, you've heard Elon's explanation, which is pretty specific, and you've heard a more cautious perspective from an expert. I think this whole thing just highlights how quickly stories can spread in the digital age, especially when someone like Elon, who has a massive platform, makes a strong statement. But it also shows us how crucial it is to look beyond those initial statements and really think critically.
Right. Consider other possibilities, listen to the experts, and don't just take everything at face value.
Exactly. So, big picture, this whole situation raises an important question. When a platform owner like Elon comes out and says, hey, this is a cyber attack and here's where it came from, what's our responsibility as users? How do we decide what information to trust? And what happens when there's no actual proof to back up those claims? I mean, those are big questions.
They really are, especially when you think about how much of our lives happen online these days.
Okay, as we're wrapping up this deep dive, the bottom line is we still don't know for sure what caused all the problems on X today. We have Elon saying it was a cyber attack from Ukraine, but we also had a lot of uncertainty. This whole thing just reminds us that the internet is a complicated place. What seems obvious at first glance might not be the whole story.
And if we step back and look at the bigger picture, this whole situation really highlights the challenges of running a global platform in today's world. These platforms are constantly dealing with technical issues, potential attacks, all sorts of things. And when something goes wrong, separating fact from fiction can be really, really hard.
So here's something to think about. We know it's super difficult to pin down who's behind the cyber attack. And we know that stories, whether they're true or not, can spread like wildfire online. So how do we stay informed without getting caught up in misinformation? What questions should we be asking ourselves when we see headlines like this? And where can we find reliable information that goes beyond the initial sound bites? It's a complex landscape out there, and this whole X outage is just one example of how tricky things can be.
Yeah, definitely a lot to unpack there.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the X outage. Hopefully we give you